Fast wide-angle vintage lenses are fairly hard to come by. Once you get to around the 20mm mark, most lenses are f3.5 or slower, which is fine, but sometimes it doesn't quite cut it. Today, I want to compare 5 lenses that are between 19mm and 21mm that I personally own that are f2.8 or faster. All of these lenses vary quite a bit in price as well, so this actually could be a pretty good test to see what you get for your money. Starting with the earliest, this is the Canon FD 20mm f2.8 SSC, which came out in 1973. They also made a later NFD version of this lens in 1979. Canon did release the holy grail of wide-angle lenses, the 24mm f1.4 in 1975, but we will not be taking a look at that one today, as I wanted to keep this video to around the 20mm mark because I haven't seen a single person make a video like this. If you want to see the 24mm in action, Media Division did a fantastic video all about the Canon FDs, as well as Spencer Sakurai made one about his FDs, so definitely go check those out. The Leica R 19mm f2.8 is a hugely popular lens, which came out in 1975. They did make a second version of this lens in 1991 with a much more complex optical design of 12 elements in 10 groups, while the first version only has 9 elements in 7 groups. Unfortunately, I do not have that lens to test today, so we are gonna have to settle for the version 1, which personally, I actually prefer. Leica R lenses in general have gained sort of a cult following over the years, and while I would love to make a video of my personal set, there are just so many videos out there that there's not really anything else to be said, so I don't know if I ever will. The Olympus OM 21mm f2 is a marvel of optical engineering. This lens came out in 1979, and it is the only lens here that opens up wider than f2.8. And along with this, it's also the smallest. They somehow managed to fit 11 elements in 9 groups and a floating element design into this tiny little package. There's definitely a reason that MovieCam uses this lens in their set for their 20mm, as well as their 17mm is this lens, but with an altered rear optic. I do plan on making a video about my Olympus OM set, hopefully in the not too distant future, so let me know if you would like to see that, because I haven't seen a single person make a video on them as a set. But as far as vintage lenses go, the Olympus OMs probably have the most cinema pedigree out of any of the vintage lens sets, so it's kind of surprising that no one's made a video on them. The Nikon AIS 20mm f2.8 came out in 1984. This lens is fantastic, and actually it's a complete bargain compared to the other lenses that we're looking at today. The Contax Zeiss 21mm f2.8 is the most modern lens here, and it came out in 1992. Out of the 5 lenses here, it is clearly the largest of the bunch, but it also is the only one that does not extend while focusing. It also has the most complex optics out of the bunch, with a floating element design comprised of 15 elements in 13 groups. I know there are a ton of other 20-ish millimeter f2.8 lenses out there from the likes of Pentax and Minolta, but we're just taking a look at these 5 today because that's what I have. Also, if I made a video of like every 20mm lens ever made, that would be like hours long. None of you would watch that because most of you don't even watch these videos all the way through. All of these lenses here are built very well, but the Canon is the only one that has a rotating front when focusing, which can be so annoying when using a CPL or a VND. This lens does look really funny when focusing with a matte box though. If I had to rank them in order of like sturdiness, I'd probably have to rank the Leica at number 1. It's the heaviest one here, and it feels like a freaking tank. The Contax Zeiss would be number 2. The Canon FD as number 3, but I cannot stand that rotating front. The Olympus would have to be number 4 just because it's so tiny. And the Nikon would have to be number 5. Nothing wrong with it, it just feels like it was made with lighter metals than the rest of them, which in turn makes it feel little less rugged. Starting off with the Leica 19, the image is fantastic. It's sharp, it has a nice fall off, and to my eye, it has a little bit of that 3D pop as well. Overall, very pleased with how the Leica looks. The Nikon has an amazing image considering how much cheaper it is than the rest. It's sharp, but not quite as sharp as the Leica, and doesn't have as much of that 3D pop. The colors also seem to be a bit more on the neutral to magenta side, while the Leica definitely leans a little bit green. The Canon wide open has decent sharpness, but I'd actually say that it's softer than the Nikon. Also, even though the Canon and the Nikon are both f2.8 lenses, the Canon does seem to be letting in a little bit less light. The Zeiss has an insanely good image, and it's probably the sharpest out of the bunch. While the other lenses seem to have a bit more of either a green or a magenta shift, the Zeiss is pretty much dead on neutral. With the Olympus, we can see the slight exposure boost from the f2 aperture, and wide open is a tad bit softer than the rest. A lot of these f2 Olympus lenses shot wide open will have a little bit of this glow to them, which I am a huge fan of. I mean, the reason we go for vintage lenses anyway is to have an imperfect image, so embrace it. Since all of these lenses are 1 to 2 millimeters apart, I thought it might be kind of interesting to see how much the field of view differs between them. The Leica being the widest at 19 millimeters obviously shows a little bit more field of view than the others. But between the Canon and the Nikon, which are both listed as 20 millimeter lenses, I can see that the Canon is ever so slightly more zoomed in. The Zeiss and the Olympus are both 20 millimeter lenses, and they are clearly tighter than the 20s, but they are pretty much identical to each other. I went with the Zeiss 21 millimeter for this video, but they do also make an 18 millimeter, although it's an f4 rather than a 2.8. But if you need a little more field of view and you don't mind the slower aperture, that lens is a fantastic option and will actually save you quite a bit of money. Olympus and Nikon also make 18 millimeters that are both f3.5, so those could be great options if you need to go wider. The Olympus 18 is a bit less expensive than the 21, but the Nikon 18 is actually more expensive than the 20 millimeter. Right out of the gate, the Leica has probably the craziest flares out of the bunch. A direct light source will basically illuminate the edges of the frame, and out of all the lenses I've tested, I haven't seen anything quite like this. I thought that stopping down the aperture might correct the edge illumination, but nope. It's still there. If you hate how they look on this lens, the later Leica 19 seems to have much more different flares to this one. Not saying the flare on the version 1 is terrible, I just think it's very polarizing. You're either gonna love it or you're gonna hate it. The Nikon has very subdued flares when the light is at the edge of the frame, and it has this wicked cool red ring when the light is right down the middle. I'm definitely a fan of this lens's flares, especially for the price. The Canon has some pretty cool lens flares, but personally, I felt they were a bit lacking compared to the Nikon. The Zeiss is very well controlled off-center. Down the middle, you get a couple of warmer rings that appear, as well as the edges of the frame become almost completely red. The Olympus's flares are right in line with what I've seen from other OM lenses. When the light is off-center, you get a bunch of flare artifacts of varying colors and shapes, and you get like a central ring when it's right down the center. None of these lenses have a particularly surprising minimum focus distance like I saw when I did the ultra wide video where the Leica and the Zeiss were almost touching the front element, but they're all respectable. The Leica is the widest lens here and also has the worst minimum focus distance, which makes objects feel even farther away and gives you even less background blur than the rest. The Nikon has a very respectable minimum focus distance at 0.25 meters, and since it's 1 millimeter tighter than the Leica, you get a lot more background blur. The Canon also has a listed minimum focus distance of 0.25 meters, but it seems like it gets a little closer. Like the previous two, the Zeiss has a minimum focus distance of 0.25 meters, and when paired with the 1mm tighter focal length, you get quite a bit more background blur than you get from the Canon or the Nikon. The Olympus is supposed to have the closest minimum focus distance at 0.2 meters, but in practice, it looks like the Zeiss gets closer. All of these lenses are vintage wide-angle photo lenses, so they're gonna have a decent bit of breathing. And if you really wanna get a good sense of how much each lens has, keep an eye on the window to the very left of frame. The Leica has a decent bit of breathing, but it's not too bad for a vintage wide-angle lens. The Nikon actually has quite a bit more breathing than the Leica. The Canon also has a good amount of breathing, and it actually appears to be a little bit worse than the Nikon. The Zeiss has probably the most controlled breathing out of the bunch, but it's also the most optically advanced and the largest, so I assume they did some corrections to this. The Olympus also has pretty subdued breathing. Not nearly as good as the Zeiss, but slightly better than the Leica. Fast wide-angle vintage lenses are typically pretty expensive, and for most of the lenses here, that is the case. The least expensive lens here is the Nikon, which typically sells for around $250 in good condition. The Canon FD SSC is the next cheapest at around $650 for a good copy. If you go for the NFD version though, that would only be about $300. The Zeiss 21mm is a pretty rare lens in the Contax lineup, and therefore pretty expensive at between $1,500 to $2,500 for a lens in good condition. The Leica R has actually come down in price quite a bit over the last couple years and can be had now for anywhere between $1,800 and $2,500 for the version 1. Since the Olympus is the fastest lens here, it should be no surprise that it is also the most expensive. A good copy of this lens can be had for anywhere between $2,500 and $3,000. This lens has also come down in price quite a lot over the last couple years, as I used to see these listed regularly for $4,000 to $5,000. It seems like the vintage lens craze from a few years ago has finally started to settle down, and all of these lenses across the board have come down a bit in price from what they were a few years ago. I had an absolute blast making this video, and I found it very interesting what you get for your money, as well as how good some of these budget options are. I was very surprised by the Nikon, seeing them all side by side, that it's both a little bit sharper and a little bit brighter than the Canon. So which of these lenses is your favorite, and which ones do you think are worth their price tag? Let me know down in the comments below. Anyway, that is gonna do it for today's video. If you enjoyed it, please consider liking and subscribing. It really does help this channel out, and I'll see you in the next one.